One of the leading figures in the American civil rights movement, the Congressman John Lewis, has died aged 80. He was one of the organisers of the 1963 March on Washington, where Martin Luther King made his "I Have a Dream" speech. Former presidents from across the political divide have paid tribute to the civil rights icon. Virginie Weidenathan looks back at his life.
John Lewis dedicated his life to fighting racism. He marched alongside Martin Luther King and lived to see a black president. Born in Alabama in 1940, John Lewis grew up in an America that was deeply segregated.
I would come home and ask my mother, ask my father, why segregation? Why racial discrimination? They would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way, don't get in trouble. But Dr. King inspired me to get in the way, to get in trouble.
As a student activist, he became a close ally of Dr. Martin Luther King, fighting racial injustice with a message of non-violence. He took part in sit-ins against white-only lunch counters and was beaten by white mobs as he peacefully protested segregation on buses.
You arrest me, you beat me, you throw me in jail. Well, what else can you do to me?
In 1963, John Lewis was the youngest speaker at the March on Washington, where Dr. King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" address. 2 years later, they marched for voting rights from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, where they were attacked by police. By the 50th anniversary of that march, John Lewis had become a politician, known as the conscience of the US Congress.
It is a rare honor in this life to follow one of your heroes. And John Lewis is one of my heroes.
Diagnosed with pancreatic cancer last year, John Lewis was seen at recent protests after the killing of George Floyd.
We must keep the faith, keep our eyes on the prize.
John Lewis lived through many chapters of the civil rights movement. His mantra was simple: never give up, never give in.
John Lewis, who's died at the age of 80.
The American civil rights leader John Lewis has died at the age of 80. He was one of the big six civil rights leaders of the 1960s, which included Martin Luther King. He stepped into history leading hundreds of protesters in a march across Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965, a crucial moment in the American civil rights movement, later turned into a Hollywood film. Rachel Younger has been looking back at his life.
A giant of the civil rights movement, John Lewis was born in Alabama at a time when the South was still dominated by racial segregation. He soon joined the struggle to change that. His embrace of non-violent resistance met with repeated beatings and imprisonment.
My soul became satisfied that I was right in what I was doing. I could no longer be satisfied or go along with an evil system.
Lewis stood alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as he spoke of his American dream, the youngest speaker at the March on Washington, and until now, the last still alive.
We are tired of being beaten by policemen. We're tired of seeing our people locked up in jail over and over again. And then you holler, be patient. How long can we be patient?
May I have a word?
There's no word to be had.
He was immortalised in the film Selma. He planned the march to Montgomery that began there in 1965, and it was the beating of the 600 protesters Lewis led by Alabama state troopers that helped galvanise opposition to racial segregation in America. 50 years later, he returned to the bridge where it happened with his country's first black president, who told him he stood on his shoulders, saying today, he not only gave all of himself to the cause of freedom and justice, but inspired generations that followed to try to live up to his example. Lewis lived to see a new generation of Americans take to the streets this year in the wake of George Floyd's death at the hands of the police. And as a senator of 3 decades standing, the man often called the conscience of the nation never stopped fighting for gun control, voting rights and freedom.
We must remove the blinders. The time for silence and patience is long gone.
John Lewis revealed in December that he had pancreatic cancer, one more battle that he fought bravely, having won so many before that helped shape the country he loved.
The American civil rights leader John Lewis, who has died at the age of 80.